first part, we'll talk about the scale of the Industrial Revolution. Now, one way that you can think about it is as a logarithmic scale. It's one, maybe you are familiar with what a log scale is, but it's kind of like an exponential scale where the line goes like that. And with an earthquake, for example, a 0.1 earthquake is something that can only be detected by the most sensitive instruments. Whereas a 10 on the scale is like if California falls off the side of the United States and goes into the Pacific Ocean. That would be, I don't think there's ever even been a 10 on the Richter scale for earthquakes. So with that in mind, if we're talking about world historical events, and say 0.1 is you dropping your phone on the ground and cracking the screen, which would be somewhat historical in the sense that you'd have to buy a new phone and there are materials that need to be involved and your life is disrupted because your phone isn't working. It's not nothing, right? There is something in the effect of you dropping your phone on the ground. I'm curious, and you can go into the chat, you can type into the chat what you think on a 0 to 10, with 0 being you dropping your phone, 0.1 being you dropping your phone and cracking the screen, and 10 being something that fundamentally changes the nature of life on Earth, similar to like a meteor strike would maybe be a 10. What do you think? And you can do it anonymously or whatever, just type your guess. What do you think the Industrial Revolution was in terms of impact on history and human society? I'm seeing some 7s and 8s, a 9, 10, and I would say that the Industrial Revolution is a 10, in fact. And we'll talk about why that's the case, but not only did it change the way that people live and our lives, but the Industrial Revolution has fundamentally shifted life on Earth itself, even human beings, just as we had stone tools and fire at the beginning of our technological adventure as human beings. But with the Industrial Revolution, we have been able to impact the existence of every bit of life on the planet due to our impact. One example of this is an invention called chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs. CFCs are the chemical that is in your refrigerator and air conditioner, and people used to use it as an accelerant in like aerosol sprays where you can like hold it down and it goes shh, and you can just hold it down. That's the CFC. And CFCs destroy ozone in the ozone layer. And we didn't realize it, how badly it destroys the ozone until in the 70s and the 80s when they realized that we weren't having an ozone layer anymore. And the ozone layer is extremely necessary to protect us from ultraviolet radiation. So anything that was potentially could have been catastrophic if we hadn't acted to correct that. And of course, now we have climate change, the number of species that have been made extinct due to human activity and changes in the environment. I mean, I don't need to explain that to you. So I would say it's arguably a 10, maybe somewhere between a 9.5, but it's not scientific. So I would argue for a 10. You can't get higher. So with that in mind, I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to do a little bit of facts here. So if we go all the way back to ancient Sumeria, which for our purposes, let's say 6,000 BCE, which means 6,000 years before zero. Again, into the chat, what percentage of ancient Sumerians do you think were farmers in ancient Sumerian society? This is the oldest civilization that we know of, the earliest. There were others that happened around the same time, but in the Mesopotamia, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, this is the oldest one that we know of now. What percentage of people living in Mesopotamia at that time were farmers? What do you think? See a wide variety. I got 37, 39, or 99, nobody, 70. So the real number we guess, because our records our ability to tell is just not great, because this is a really, really, really long time ago and we don't have that much information that survives. But based on what we've got, it seems as though upwards of 90% of people were farmers in ancient Mesopotamia, almost practically prehistoric. This is the earliest agricultural societies that we got. So now let's jump ahead to the United States in 1820, actually 1820. Well, it's actually 1824, but just for the sake of elegance, what percentage of Americans in 1820? Now, this is almost 8,000 years later. And to put that into scale, if you think about like ancient Greece and Rome or Iron Age China, whatever time period you want to go around, about zero, the year zero, the year zero is 2,000 years ago, which is extremely old. And when we think of old, we often think of like Greek columns and Roman columns and things like that. And that's 2,000 years ago. And so the ancient Sumeria is almost 3 times as old as that to the ancient Greeks. So we're talking 8,000 years of experience, human development and progress, etc. What percentage of Americans do you think, nearly 8,000 years later, were farmers in 1820? Again, put it in the chat. Give me some of your guesses here. 10%, 37, 15, 30. So a lot of people guessing kind of like a significant decrease in that 8,000 year time span. Because yeah, 8,000 years is a really, really long time. But it's actually higher than that. And in 1820, it would have been about 84% people were farmers. So in that nearly 8,000 years, we have almost no change. And honestly, that 6% decrease is more of a function of the Industrial Revolution that's already been happening in 1820 than it is the fact that something changed. Because prior to the Industrial Revolution, you just needed more people growing food for themselves than you needed them doing anything else. It required a huge expenditure of human effort to just make enough food for everybody. Now, the number of people in the world did increase at this point. So there is some efficiency that got involved, but we still required that many people. And it almost seemed like there was a limit as to the number of population that you could have in the world using pre-industrial farming. And that number was about 1 billion worldwide. And there's even some famous political theorists like a guy named Malthus who said that we did have a hard limit, because every time you go over this, you make more food that makes more people, but then when the amount of food goes down due to famine or weather or climate or whatever, then everybody dies and it goes back to that kind of hard level. So considering that in 8,000 years, we have changed almost not at all, let's talk about the United States this year. This year, ignoring our current pandemic and everything, that hasn't changed very much. What percentage of Americans today do you think, go ahead and put it in the chat, what percentage of Americans today do you think are farmers? Remembering that we only lost about 6% of farmers in 8,000 years, and now we've gone 200 years. So what do you think? So intuitively, we would think it wouldn't be very much, but we've got some people guessing somewhat more accurately. Lena kind of pretty much hit the nail on the head there. Less than 3% of Americans are farmers today. So this is a little bit more support for the idea of the 10 on the logarithmic scale in terms of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution fundamentally changed what it means to be a human being, what a human being's life was like, how many people they knew, whether or not they could read, what kind of products that they had access to. And this is the next thing we're going to talk about this half hour. But so we see just how unbelievably impactful the Industrial Revolution was. You can put it on the scale of all of human history, and it's arguably more impactful even than the Agricultural Revolution, even though we couldn't have had the Industrial without the Agricultural. So another thing I like to mention is, like, just think about how many people do you know that are farmers? If you think about it in the past, 200 years ago, almost everybody you almost certainly would have been working on a farm your entire life, even up until your age right now. And almost everybody you knew would be a farmer. And you would likely not have left the territory that you grew up in more than, say, I don't know, like 30, 40 kilometers, 20 miles or so from your home. There's a common misconception that not everybody could read, that everybody was illiterate. And there's some truth to that, but a lot more people could read than people give the past credit for. It's just they couldn't read in the ways that where they weren't writing books, right? If you got to make all your food, you don't have a lot of time to write books or write letters or anything like that. And besides, everybody you know is living next to you anyway. So why do you need to write a letter? Okay, so with that in mind, let's talk about how this happened. In my experience, a lot of people just kind of assume like, well, yeah, you have the Industrial Revolution, and so the industry is revolutionized, and then boom, 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 you get our modern world. But how does that actually happen? If everybody's a farmer, why does everybody decide to go from their farm to the city, right? For example, in 1880s, the city of Chicago in the United States, I'm American, so all my examples are American examples, but in the United States just makes a very stark picture of the influence of the Industrial Revolution. The city of Chicago had a population of something like 150 to 200,000 people in 1880. But by 1900, in just 20 years, the population of Chicago had exploded to about 2 million. People were coming in from the countryside left and right. There wasn't a war. There wasn't a massive upheaval. There wasn't a disease or a plague or anything like that. How is it that the invention of some inventions could lead to a mass migration of human beings all across the globe? That's what I want you to consider. Like, go ahead and consider it for a second. I'm going to tell you the answer, but I want you to consider it for a second. How exactly could inventions dislodge millions of people from their homes and force them to move into slums and tenements with no laws, into workplaces that were dangerous and boring and challenging? What do they get out of it? If anybody has a guess, go ahead and put it in the chat. So first step, I want you to look at your shirt. Whatever shirt you're wearing, I want you to look down and take a look at the fineness of the weaving of the cloth on your clothing. How tight is the weave on your shirt? And I want you to ask yourself, if you couldn't buy that, would you be able to make that? If it's just a cotton t-shirt or polyester t-shirt, it really doesn't matter, because the answer, almost certainly, if you really look at the weave of that, you can't make that. I don't think hardly any individual human being would be able to put together the machinery to make a loom and weave the loom and make the cloth, etc., to make the clothing that you wear. And now on top of that, consider where you're living. Would you be able to live without clothing? How long would you last from this point right now? How many months would you survive if you couldn't make your own clothing and you would have to learn how to make your own clothing and etc.? It's a little bit odd that we have evolved to have none of our, body hair and all. We've evolved to wear things that we have to make. Well, it's evolutionarily advantageous for us to wear things that we have to make. And that was still true in the agricultural period when everybody was a farmer. Everybody either had to make their own clothes or trade their goods with someone who knew how to make clothes. Not everybody had a loom at home, but a lot of people did have a loom at home. It was such a common thing to make your own thread and cloth that, it's in Sleeping Beauty. How does Sleeping Beauty fall asleep? Her prophecy is that she's going to prick her finger on the spinning wheel. The spinning wheel is how you turn wool into thread, how you turn wool into cloth. Well, not into the cloth, but to the thread at least. This was a common everyday thing. At this time, prior to the Industrial Revolution, the home, the farm, was itself the center of industrial production. You didn't have factories everywhere. Every farm was itself a factory. Part of the reason why we have the gender differences, at least in terms of gender roles, is because of the necessity of those agricultural things. The man would go out into the field and plow the field because, generally speaking, men have more upper body strength. So they were the ones who went out into the field and moved the plow and hit the ox to pull the plow, etc. And the woman who would be at home, she would have the children because, you know, men can't have the children. So you needed as many people as you could to work on the farm. So there was an incentive to have more people. Child mortality rates were very high. Something like 40% of infants didn't survive to the year 10. Very high infant mortality rates in the pre-industrial period. So it was in people's best interests to have as many children as possible, because every child who survived would then be workers for the farm. So women are inside, men are out in the fields. The men gather the raw materials, they shear the sheep, they plow the land. Again, this is generally speaking. There's always exceptions, and certainly women did everything, and men would often do everything, although it doesn't always go both ways. But the women turned the raw materials into the finished product. That's why weaving and cloth making, sewing was seen so much as a female job. It was extraordinarily important, and it could be done inside while the kids are running around, right? The thing is, if you think about actually making your clothes, that would be really, really, really hard. And the chances that you make something, you know, imperfectly, it's just extraordinarily time consuming and ineffective. So when the textile industry arose in Britain, and in many places, but mostly in Britain, and they could produce not only vast quantities of textiles, but also at a really high quality for relatively low price, everybody is like, yeah, they chuck their spinning wheel out into the forests for the fairies and pixies and whatever, like, thanks, but no thanks. I don't want to make my own cloth anymore. It's just way cheaper for me to buy my cloth. And in the early days, you could probably trade goods, because at that time, again, you knew everybody in your neighborhood. You could trade goods with everybody in your neighborhood. Maybe you didn't grow potatoes, but you grew wheat, and you could trade your wheat for potatoes, or you could trade a cow for a new plow, or whatever, however you want to do bartering. The thing about textiles from Britain is you can't ship a cow to Britain to the factory to get the textiles that you want. So people started needing more cash to buy goods that were shipped from further away. And prior to that, people mostly ate what they made, and they traded the surplus. But now that, and they didn't have much need for money, but now, because there's so many goods that you can buy, because textiles were just the beginning, there were all sorts of things that could be manufactured more cheaply and efficiently away from the home. People started to need more money. So they needed to start selling more of their goods on the open market so they could have more cash on hand. They still were making enough food to eat for themselves, but they also needed to focus more on selling their crops. And of course, since everybody was doing that, if you know your economics, the more goods that are for sale, what happens to the price of goods? It goes down. So in order to make the money that you need, you have to sell more and more of your goods. And you have to produce more and more that then go into the market, which then drives the price of the food further down, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so eventually, you're not really keeping any of your crops. You're not eating any of your crops. You're only selling the things that you're making on the farm. And every year, you're making less and less and less and less money. And now the only thing you're doing is selling. So you're not able to put anything in the bank. You're not able to add onto your farm. You're not able to change anything about your circumstance. So it looks like a sucker's game for you to stay in your farm when you can just go to the city and start working for this factory instead. And the only people who were able to make money from farming were people who had larger and larger farms rather than a single small homestead. And now this didn't happen like overnight. Historically speaking, it did happen overnight. And even by, say, like the 1930s in the United States, still 30 to 40% of people were farmers in the United States because there was a lot of land there. But by the 1980s, that number had dropped to 20, 15, 10%. And now today, I know farmers, but it's unlikely that unless your grandparents had a farm, it's unlikely that you actually know any farmers, because there are not that many places in the United States where farming is the dominant industry anymore, or at least it doesn't require that many people. So in order to get money that they needed, because the price of crops dropped, and in order to get money, people moved into the city. I mean, that's a simple thing, but this is how it happened. This is why they needed money rather than selling their crops. So hopefully those two things, the scale of the agriculture prior to the Industrial Revolution and the motivations, the individual motivations, the economic motivations for people to move into the city where the factories were, hopefully that is a little more clear about the scale of the Industrial Revolution